of the world's, I guess, silence on the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Yeah, that feeling of silence, yeah.
Yeah, you've seen the headlines, right? Heard the debates. Maybe you've even felt that frustration yourself. Is it really silence?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it something else?
Something maybe more complicated going on underneath.
Exactly. Our mission today, really, is to unpack all of that. The geopolitical stuff, the history, the humanitarian side, all the layers that kind of explain why the international response looks the way it does.
And we're drawing on quite a few sources here. There's a really candid YouTube analysis from Umar Mir, a big geopolitical report looking at global responses.
Right. Plus some pretty eye-opening news reports from places like BBC News and CNN as well.
So the goal is really to get past the simple narratives, the easy answers.
Yeah, to help you really understand what's actually happening. So maybe let's start with the situation on the ground, the human cost.
Yeah, let's set the scene. Because the humanitarian catastrophe, it's hard to overstate. The attacks have reportedly led to around 62,000 Palestinian casualties.
62,000.
And what's just harrowing is that number includes something like 18,000 children. And tragically, 214 of those were newborns.
It's almost unimaginable. And that's just casualties. What about injuries, displacement?
Well, over 111,000 people reported injured or disabled, and displacement, a staggering 90% of Gaza's population.
90%.
90%. That's nearly 2 million people in this tiny, tiny strip of land, 365 square kilometers forced from their homes.
Which is why some of our sources use that term, open-air prison.
Exactly. And the conditions, well, they're beyond dire. Electricity is out for hours. 97% of the drinking water is undrinkable.
97%.
Schools destroyed. Hospitals collapsing. Attacks can happen anywhere, anytime. So with all this suffering, the big question our sources raise is, why does it look like the international community is completely silent?
Right. And that's where it gets really, really interesting. Because what our deep dive shows is that this idea of silence, it's actually... well, it's misleading. It's an oversimplification.
It really is. It's not silence at all. It's more like a complex mess, maybe. A tapestry of different responses, some contradictory, many just ineffective actions and inactions all tangled up.
Yeah, a cacophony almost, rather than silence. Because the big global powers, they're driven by their own stuff, right? Strategic needs, history, what's happening back home.
Absolutely. And those different approaches clash. They create this gridlock that from the outside feels like global inaction, even when there's this huge humanitarian crisis happening.
Okay, so if it's a cacophony, what are the main tunes being played? What are the core narratives, the justifications we keep hearing? Let's maybe start with Israel's position.
Okay, so Israel consistently frames its actions as self-defense. And that narrative often brings up the Holocaust, the massacre of approximately 6 million Jews in World War II.
And the never again promise that came out of that.
Exactly. That international agreement post-World War II meant to stop future genocides. The creation of Israel itself in 1948 as a separate state, the land of Jews, was a direct result of that history, the idea of needing a secure homeland.
But then you have the flip side. The Palestinian counter-narrative, the Nakba, the catastrophe.
Right, because the creation of Israel in 1948, from their perspective, meant the displacement of around 750,000 Palestinians from their land.
So that immediately throws up this really difficult question, doesn't it? Was never again only meant for one group? Does it feel to Palestinians and others like what's happening now is somehow acceptable under that same international promise?
And our sources definitely highlight that profound frustration. Some voices in Palestine and the Middle East are asking these really disturbing questions about double standards. This feeling that the world only pays attention when certain groups suffer, but not Palestinians.
And then there are accusations that leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu manipulate this history.
Yes, accusations that he uses it to justify current actions, even comparing Palestinian resistance, which, let's be clear, doesn't have a major army or modern weapons to the Nazi regime. It just shows how deeply, deeply contested these historical narratives are.
Okay, so these are the core narratives clashing. Now, who are the big players on the world stage influencing this? What are their motivations? Let's start with the U.S. Their relationship with Israel is unique.
It's often called a special relationship, yeah. It's deeply rooted, going back decades, economic ties, strategic alignment, military cooperation, really solidifying after the 1960s.
And it's not just talk, right? The support is concrete.
Very concrete. We're talking huge amounts of military aid. In 2023, it was over $3.8 billion. That's part of a 10-year, $38 billion agreement,
Wow.
And there's more like a potential $20 billion arms sale coming up in August 2024, plus significant loan guarantees. It ensures Israel maintains its military edge.
And diplomatically, they act as a shield, don't they? Particularly at the UN.
Absolutely. The U.S. veto power in the UN Security Council, it's been used 42 times against resolutions critical of Israel. That's out of only 83 total U.S. vetoes ever.
42 times. That's significant.
It is. It's effectively blocked multiple UN ceasefire resolutions, especially during this recent conflict. Historically, Israel's just been seen as this crucial strategic partner for the U.S. in the Middle East.
What about the two-state solution? The U.S. technically supports it, right?
In principle, yes. But active U.S. diplomatic energy and really pushing for that solution it's waned quite a bit in recent years.
And internally, within the U.S., things are shifting.
Massively. Public approval of Israel's actions has dropped significantly. Overall, only about a third approve. Among Democrats, it's down to just 8%. Independents, around 25%.
Yet Congress seems largely unaffected by that shift.
Pretty much. Congress remains overwhelmingly pro-Israel, and powerful lobbying groups like AIPAC are a big factor there. So you have this real split public opinion moving one way, official policy staying pretty firm, creates a lot of internal tension.
Okay, let's cross the Atlantic. The European Union, what's their stance?
Well, officially, the EU is committed to a two-state solution. They actively support the Palestinian Authority. And economically, they're huge for Israel, its largest trading partner. We're talking $42.6 billion in trade in 2024.
So with that leverage, why don't they seem to act more decisively?
That's the crux of it. The EU is deeply divided internally. You've got some countries, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain, for instance, pushing for tougher measures, maybe even arms embargoes.
But others block it.
Yeah, the big economic players, Germany, Italy, Austria, they consistently block collective sanctions. So despite public sympathy for Israel being at its lowest point in Western Europe and growing support for Palestinians, the EU as a whole struggles to form a unified policy. It really highlights a kind of democratic deficit, public mood versus policy outcomes.
Interesting. Okay. Shifting east now.
Yeah.
China. How are they positioning themselves?
China's playing a careful game. They present themselves as advocates for peace, consistently calling for a ceasefire, pushing for an independent Palestinian state. Notably, they didn't explicitly condemn the Hamas attacks on October 7th.
What's driving their approach? Is it ideals or interests?
It seems primarily driven by long-term economic and energy interests. Think about their Belt and Road Initiative. Stability in the region is key. They also maintain ties with both sides, significant trade with Israel, but also a huge investment commitment with Iran.
So balancing act.
Exactly. Trying to be a balanced global power, often criticizing U.S. support for Israel as biased. Domestically, the conflict hasn't caused huge waves, although, worryingly, some anti-Semitic theories have surfaced in online discussions there.
Okay, and finally, Russia. Their approach seems opportunistic.
Highly opportunistic, yes. They're looking to boost their own global standing, play the regional dynamics. Interestingly, Israel hasn't sanctioned Russia over Ukraine, and they've maintained relations.
But Russia has condemned Israel's actions in Gaza.
They have. They've provided aid to Palestinians, and crucially, they don't designate Hamas as a terrorist group. They've even held diplomatic talks with them.
And arms sales play a role.
Definitely. Russia is the world's second largest arms exporter. Sales to the Middle East and North Africa are a key foreign policy tool. And, let's be honest, the Gaza conflict has been useful for them. It diverts Western attention and resources away from Ukraine, potentially weakening Western unity. It's a complex geopolitical game.
So we see all these major powers with their own agendas. But they all operate within or sometimes against the framework of international law and institutions, right? Which brings us to the UN Security Council again. You mentioned the veto paralysis.
It's the fundamental problem, isn't it? The UNSC is supposed to maintain international peace, but the veto power of the 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, Russia, China, often grinds it to a halt.
Especially on this issue with the US veto count.
Exactly. 42 U.S. vetoes shielding Israel, blocking ceasefire resolutions repeatedly, even when the UN Secretary General took the rare step of invoking Article 99.
Which is a big deal, right? Allows him to bring threats to peace directly to the Council.
It is a big deal. The measure used very infrequently, but even that was shot down by a U.S. veto. So you have the UN General Assembly, all 193 members, voting overwhelmingly for ceasefires, like 153 states did back in December 2023.
But those votes don't actually force anyone to do anything.
Precisely. They're non-binding. So the collective will of the world is expressed, but it's ultimately ineffective because of the Security Council's structure. It feeds that perception of the UN being powerless.
Beyond the UN politics, what about international courts? Are they having any impact? The International Criminal Court, the ICC?
They're certainly active, but face huge political hurdles. The ICC, remember, it prosecutes individuals for war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, started investigating the situation in Palestine back in March 2021.
And they've issued arrest warrants.
Yes, and this is significant. Warrants for a Hamas commander, Mohammed Deif, but also, very notably, for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
For what specific alleged crimes?
Alleged war crimes, including the use of starvation as a method of warfare. Now, predictably, Israel and its allies strongly oppose the ICC's jurisdiction and involvement here.
And then there's the other big court, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ.
Right. The ICJ deals with disputes between states. They issued an advisory opinion in July 2024. Pretty damning. It ruled Israel's long-term occupation of Palestinian territory since 1967, the settlements, the resource exploitation, all illegal under international law.
Did they order anything?
Yes, they ordered Israel to take measures to prevent genocide and to facilitate humanitarian aid into Gaza. The EU actually supported the ruling, but the US criticized it, and Israel. They formally rejected it.
So again, we see this pattern. Legal findings are made, but enforcement.
That's the gap. There's a huge gap between what international law says and the political will to enforce it, especially when powerful allies are involved.
And this applies to international humanitarian law, IHL too, the Geneva Conventions.
Absolutely. IHL applies to everyone in the conflict. The rules are clear. No punitive sieges, no collective punishment, no targeting civilians, no forcible displacement. Aid must be allowed in.
But the reality on the ground,
Starkly different. Israel's maintained a near-total blockade on Gaza since 2007. Blockades that lead to starvation are clearly illegal under IHL. We hear reports from UNRWA about deepening starvation, kids dying from malnutrition because of Israeli restrictions on aid.
and the displacement zones.
Over 86% of Gaza is now designated as militarized or displacement zones. Amnesty International calls what's happening war crimes. So the legal framework is there, the violations seem clear to many observers, but the international community appears, well, powerless is the word that keeps coming up. There's a lack of consequences.
This lack of consequence, the political maneuvering, it doesn't happen in isolation. This conflict has huge regional implications. Let's talk about Iran and its axis of resistance.
Right. Iran actively backs groups like Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Their strategy, sometimes called unifying the fronts, basically suggests an attack on one member of this network could trigger a response from others.
And we've seen that risk become reality, haven't we?
We certainly have. The conflict has already escalated to direct exchanges. There was that suspected Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus back in April 2024.
Followed by Iran launching drones and missiles at Israel.
Exactly. And then retaliatory strikes. Sources even mention simulations of a potential full-scale war in June 2025, involving hundreds of strikes and even U.S. action against Iranian nuclear sites. The risk of this spiraling into a much wider regional war is incredibly real.
Meanwhile, what about the Arab states? They were moving towards normalizing relations with Israel through things like the Abraham Accords. How has this conflict affected that?
It's put them in a very tough spot. They're trying to balance that normalization push with their historical support for the Palestinians. The Gaza war has definitely strained those normalization efforts.
Do Arab leaders face pressure from their own populations?
Immense pressure. While many Arab leaders might have little sympathy for Hamas itself, public opinion across the Arab world is strongly pro-Palestinian. So they have to perform this delicate balancing act, especially if Israel were to launch a full-ground invasion. It's a very fragile situation for them.
And the conflict keeps spilling over borders, creating new flashpoints. Lebanon, for instance.
Yeah, Hezbollah started firing rockets into Israel almost immediately after October 7th in solidarity with Palestinians. There have been daily exchanges of fire across that border ever since, displacing communities on both sides.
And Syria?
Syria remains a key transit route for Iran to supply weapons to Hezbollah and Hamas. So Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes inside Syria, over 220 in the first year of the war alone, trying to disrupt those supply lines and deter Iranian proxies operating there.
Then there's the Red Sea. That's become a major global choke point.
Absolutely. The Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen started launching missiles and drones towards Israel, but then escalated to attacking commercial shipping passing through the Red Sea.
Which has had huge economic consequences.
Massive. It severely impacted shipping routes, forcing ships to go the long way around Africa. Trade to Israel's port of Eilat basically collapsed, reportedly facing bankruptcy. And Egypt's Suez Canal revenues plummeted. It shows how a localized conflict can disrupt global trade.
Beyond the physical conflict, there's this whole other battlefield, the information war. How media covers this is crucial, isn't it?
It's incredibly contested. Critics often point to Western mainstream media, arguing there's a pro-Israel bias. You see it sometimes in the language used, framing Israeli actions as purely self-defense, using passive voice for Palestinian deaths, like people die instead of being killed.
While maybe humanizing Israeli victims more directly.
That's the criticism, yes.
Yeah.
Conversely, Arab media often focuses heavily on Palestinian suffering, sometimes graphically emphasizing the collective experience. This shapes public understanding dramatically. Different audiences are essentially getting different realities presented to them.
And social media throws another wrench in the works.
Big time. It allows for instant updates, grassroots perspectives, which can be powerful. But it's also, a breeding ground for misinformation and disinformation.
Like what kind of things?
Unverified reports, images taken out of context or altered, even bizarre claims about crisis actors. And it goes both ways. Both sides actively engage in propaganda. There are reports, for instance, of the Israeli government using AI tools and bot networks to try and shape the narrative, dehumanize Palestinians, sow discord.
So it becomes incredibly hard to know what's true.
Exactly. The lack of reliable, independently verified information, plus the intense polarization of the conflict itself, creates these echo chambers. People aren't even working from the same set of facts, which makes finding common ground, let alone a unified international response, almost impossible.
And all of this is happening while the world is juggling, well, all of other major problems. Because competing crises must divert attention and resources, right?
Undeniably. The war in Ukraine is still a massive geopolitical focus. It's directly competing with Gaza for military and financial aid, especially from the US and the EU.
Which Russia probably likes.
Oh, they openly celebrate it. They hope it means fewer Western resources going to Kyiv. But it's not just Ukraine. Think about the global economy facing serious headwinds, instability. Governments everywhere are focused on stabilizing things at home.
And climate change isn't going away.
Exactly. That requires huge investment, huge political will. Plus, you have other devastating conflicts like the war in Sudan, causing its own refugee crisis and affecting Red Sea stability. And global displacement overall is at record levels, expected to hit 123 million people by the end of 2024.
So there's only so much attention, so much money, so much political capital to go around.
Precisely. These competing demands inevitably dilute the focus on any one crisis, including Gaza. It's not necessarily silence or indifference. It's also about bandwidth being stretched incredibly thin.
Let's bring it back to the human cost, because the humanitarian crisis is just getting worse, and the blame game around it is intense. What are the latest reports on the ground?
They're grim. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza reports 180 deaths just from lack of food since the war began. That includes 93 children. Just recently, 5 more deaths in 24 hours.
Just from hunger.
Yes. And we've seen news reports, verified accounts of at least 27 Palestinians killed while trying to get aid, apparently when Israeli troops opened fire near distribution points. The images of severely malnourished children, they're heartbreaking.
Aid convoys themselves are dangerous.
Incredibly dangerous. UN teams have even filmed live rounds being fired towards desperate crowds trying to get food. We hear stories from families whose loved ones were killed by tank shells just trying to reach supplies. Cindy McCain from the World Food Program put it starkly. Normally, for a population this size, they'd have 400 distribution sites. Now, only 4.
4 sites for nearly 2 million people.
It creates chaos, desperation, and incredibly dangerous conditions.
Which inevitably leads to this fierce debate. Who is responsible for this suffering?
It's intensely debated. You hear arguments, like on a CNN panel discussed in our sources, that the U.S. is profoundly complicit, that U.S. weapons are enabling starvation, U.S. diplomacy is blocking international justice, essentially saying the blood is on our hands.
What's the counter-argument?
The counter often blames Hamas for starting the war on October 7th, for the suffering of dozens subsequently, sometimes accusing them of weaponizing aid, stealing it from the UN, reselling it, and for making supposedly unreasonable demands in hostage negotiations.
But there's a rebuttal to that, too.
Yes. The rebuttal points back to Israel cutting off all food, water, and electricity for the first 3 months, and raises questions about Israel's ongoing control over how much aid gets in and where it can go. It's a deeply polarized blame game.
And amidst all this, you have the families of the Israeli hostages?
Their anguish is immense. Supporters have been blocking roads in Israel, demanding the unconditional release of hostages, but also calling for a ceasefire, more aid for Gaza, demilitarization. A recent Hamas video showing a hostage looking emaciated just intensified that pain and pressure.
Now, critically, what is the stated Israeli government policy on Gaza's future? Our sources mentioned something about the Trump plan.
Yes, this is a crucial point from the sources. The official Israeli government position is stated as supporting the Trump plan, which apparently entails the eventual expulsion of all Palestinians from Gaza.
Expulsion.
That's the term used in the source material reporting the government position. And it points out that even in the West Bank, where Hamas isn't in control, Palestinians face ongoing displacement and live under conditions that Israeli human rights groups themselves call apartheid.
And the Israeli defense minister specifically mentioned implementing this.
Reportedly, yes, stating they are implementing the Trump plan by concentrating the population into a tiny fraction of Gaza, about 12%, making life so hellish that the hope is people will choose to leave. This official stance really challenges any narrative focused purely on Israeli humanitarian concern.
But is everyone in Israel on board with this?
Not at all. There seems to be a significant internal debate. Our sources mention hundreds of retired Israeli security officials. We're talking former heads of Mossad, Shin Bet, 3 former military chiefs of staff writing to the U.S. president.
What are they asking for?
They're urging him to pressure their own government to end the war. Their argument is that Hamas no longer poses a strategic threat to Israel that justifies the current scale of operations. This shows a real split within the Israeli security establishment itself about the war's aims and continuation.
Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground here. Bringing it all together, what does this mean for you, our listener, that initial feeling of silence?
Well, as we've seen, our deep dive suggests that silence is really the wrong word. It's a profound mischaracterization. It's not that there's no concern or no activity.
It's more that what is happening is incredibly complex. A mix of geopolitical maneuvering, the real limitations of international bodies like the UN Security Council.
Exactly. Plus, that relentless information war, the propaganda, the difficulty finding truth. And layered on top of all that, the sheer number of other global crises demanding attention and resources. It all combines to create this effect of inaction or silence, even if the reality is much noisier and more complicated.
And what this really throws into sharp relief is how major powers often prioritize their own strategic interests, their alliances, their domestic politics, over unified international action, even when it comes to enforcing basic international law.
Right. When institutions like the UN Security Council are paralyzed, despite legal rulings from courts like the ICJ or widespread global calls for intervention, it seriously damages their credibility. It erodes the very principles of international humanitarian law they're supposed to uphold.
So when the law exists, but the political will to enforce it is missing, especially for certain actors, the result feels like silence in terms of real consequences.
Precisely. Which leads us to a final, maybe provocative thought for you to consider. In this world where information is so easily manipulated, where powerful global institutions often seem gridlocked, what can we as individuals actually do? How do we navigate these competing narratives? And what responsibility do we have to push for accountability, to demand a more effective, unified response when humanitarian catastrophes like this unfold?
Something to think about. How interconnected all these global challenges really are, and how sometimes what looks like silence from afar is actually sending a very loud, very complex message about the state of our world, the state of global governance, and maybe the future of peace itself.